Excellencies, members of the Council, members of the core group, thank you for the opportunity to address the Council today on the critical issue of the human rights of people in vulnerable situations in the context of climate change. The Center for International Environmental Law welcomes the study prepared on this topic by the Secretary General. The climate crisis is accelerating around the world. And with that acceleration, we see impacts on a large number of rights protected by international human rights law. These impacts do not fall equally upon the people of the world. They fall disproportionately on the global South and disproportionately on those in vulnerable situations. Nowhere was this more exemplified than in the final report in the Philippines Commission on Human Rights landmark inquiry into the human rights impacts of climate change in the Philippines and the responsibilities of the carbon majors companies. The commission found that the people of the Philippines are bearing a disproportionate burden from the climate crisis, and that burden is following heavily on women and girls who suffer in several significant areas, including agricultural production, climate-induced migration, and post-disaster gender-based violence. It falls on children. In the case of Typhoon Haiyan, we know that almost 6 million of the 14 million people affected by the typhoon were children. It falls on indigenous communities who are uniquely at risk because the environment is a natural extension of their livelihood, their survival, and their cultural identity. It falls on those in poverty, as the poorest communities are especially vulnerable because of the shortage of socioeconomic resources necessary to cope with climate impacts. And it falls on the LGBTQIA community, which is often denied access to social opportunities and infrastructure needed to cope with climate impacts. Protecting the human rights of people in vulnerable situations requires urgent action to limit warming to the greatest extent possible. The Commission thus recognized not only the responsibility of the carbon majors companies and the Philippine governments to act in this regard, but the duty of all governments to cooperate to protect people from climate-related harms. Achieving this requires mainstreaming human rights in climate action, including in decisions related to climate finance and adaptation, not only within, but between and among states. This is critical because while together the members of the G20 nations are responsible for 80% of global emissions, small island and developing states and least developed countries that combined account for only 2% of those emissions. The responsibility for the climate crisis is not shared equally, and the responsibility for climate action must fall most heavily on those who have driven the crisis across history and across the world. States parties to the UN climate agreements have obligations to mobilize climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building through international cooperation. This obligation echoes the duty of states under Article 2.1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to work together to mobilize the maximum available resources for the progressive realization of human rights. These obligations require a dramatic and urgent scaling up of climate finance and a recognition that funds must flow with equal urgency to loss and damage and adaptation as they do to mitigation. The terms for climate financing critically must not further exacerbate the existing structural inequalities or add to recipient countries' debt burdens. Without substantial upscaling, a more equitable distribution, and facilitated access for the countries and people most affected by climate change, climate finance will continue to fall far short of commitments made by developed countries in the context of both climate change and human rights. Decisive progress on these issues will be essential at COP27 to make progress towards meeting these obligations and protecting the rights of the communities most vulnerable to climate change. For this reason, CL reiterates its embrace of the Secretary General's report and welcomes the decision by the Special Rapporteur to focus his next thematic report on actions to address climate change, particularly in the context of loss and damage, including what actions are necessary with respect to financial support, remedies, and redress for individuals and communities in vulnerable situations. Thank you for the opportunity.